It was in early November of 1997 that a series of very strange sessions led a child psychologist in Maine to contact the authorities. It began when a patient of his began to tell him about one of their friends. This friend being imaginary as far as both the psychiatrist and the boy's parents were concerned. He called his friend Mr. Smile and would talk about him at great length during some sessions. The boy called him Mr. Smile both because he would always be smiling and because when he was around the boy said everything felt happy. He said that there was a feeling of everything being okay. The boy in question was being treated for serious issues to do with anger and depression. But when Mr. Smile was around, he said that all the anger and the sadness seemed to just disappear. He said that Mr. Smile wouldn't speak but rather just stand there at the foot of his bed. He smelled like candy floss. And just by being there, he made the boy feel calm and safe. The psychiatrist assumed this imaginary friend was some sort of coping mechanism the boy had developed to deal with the problems at home that had led to his violent temper and thought nothing much of it. Until another patient, a girl of about 9 years old, also began talking about her imaginary friend, Mr. Smile, and then a boy of 7, and then a boy of 12, and then a girl of 11. All in all, close to 15 separate patients, all began to talk to him about Mr. Smile. The first few he'd put down to coincidence. After all, many children have imaginary friends, and the name and description of Mr. Smile were just generic enough that it didn't concern him too much at first. But as more and more of his patients told him about Mr. Smile, he began to grow concerned. He asked for more details. Every single one of them described him the same way, using the exact same words. Now, there was no way that all of these children could be in contact with each other. 5 of them, for instance, were currently being homeschooled, and according to their parents, when he spoke to them, never really even left the house, except when it was to accompany them on shopping trips and the like. There was no way that every single one of these kids could have rehearsed or prepared their statements together, which led him to a deeply disturbing conclusion. He spoke privately with each of the children's parents one at a time. He avoided disclosing too much information, but told them that something troubling had cropped up in multiple sessions with various patients, and that he believed that there was a chance their child was at risk. He asked for their permission to discuss matters with the authorities, and the parents gave their consent, provided they were kept in the loop as to what was going on. And so, over the course of the next week, the police came and talked to the children about their friend. They asked for details about his appearance, which they couldn't seem to describe apart from the smile and that he was not like them. How he got into their house, anything he said or did while he was there. Because by this point, the psychiatrist, the parents, and the police were all convinced that Mr. Smile was quite real and quite dangerous. The authorities had checked to make sure there were no known predators living in the area, which they had confirmed was not the case. But it was quite clear that whoever this Mr. Smile was, he was a real person who had been sneaking into the homes of these children at night. None of the children claimed to know how he got in. They said they would just wake up and he'd be there at the foot of their bed. Sometimes they said he would be singing something, but not in English. It sounded like a lullaby, they said. It made them feel safe. Finally, the children were asked to draw Mr. Smile, as they couldn't put into words how he looked. Each and every one of the children picked up a red crayon and proceeded to color in the entire page until it was just a rectangle of red. When asked about this, they insisted that they had drawn Mr. Smile. When asked where his head, arms, and legs were, they would insist that they had drawn those. They claimed that they had drawn a perfect picture of the man at the foot of their bed, and when they were told that they had simply colored in the page and not drawn anything at all, they became deeply angry, feeling that they were being accused of lying and insisting that what they had drawn was a picture of the man they had seen. Acting more on a hunch than anything else, the psychiatrist decided to show one of the colored in rectangles to the various children and ask them what it was. Each and every one of them, with no knowledge of what the picture was supposed to be or who had drawn it, and with no knowledge that the other children that had been spoken to about this subject even existed, replied that it was a picture of Mr. Smile. Cameras and baby monitors were placed in the children's rooms so that they could be monitored. Many of the parents simply stopped sleeping altogether, staying up all night staring at the screens that displayed where their children slept. At no point did anyone enter or exit the bedrooms. No sounds except for them snoring or occasionally talking in their sleep were heard over the baby monitors. There was no sign of Mr. Smile. After almost 2 weeks of this, many of them began to doubt that Mr. Smile had ever existed. Other psychiatrists since have put the whole thing down to some strange shared delusion that, while it couldn't be explained yet, did not have any basis in reality. Some suggested that maybe this whole Mr. Smile thing had its basis in a TV show or film that the children had all watched, leading them all to dream up something similar. Then one of the boys went missing. The camera in his room had gone dead at around 2 in the morning. His mother had run to check in on him, only to find his room empty. It had literally taken her less than a minute to run to his room. There was no possible way for him to leave, or be taken, and be out of her sight in the time it took her to leave her bedroom and run towards his, but he was gone. She said there was a smell like cotton candy in the room. The search for the boy turned up nothing. No one had seen anything strange or unusual around the home before or during the disappearance, and no trace of him was ever found. It was less than a week later that one of the girls who had spoken of Mr. Smile vanished as well. Then another of the boys. One by one, each of them began to disappear until only 4 remained. The 4 remaining children began to talk about how Mr. Smile and his friends were going to take them away soon. When asked about these friends, they talked about how Mr. Smile lived with the other smiling men in the happy place, and that he would take them there soon. They said that there were lots of people there already, and that in the happy place everything was beautiful. They said that they knew about it because Mr. Smile talked to them in their heads because he couldn't talk like other people did, and that he would show them pictures in their heads of the place they were going. Things began to get increasingly disturbing. After a few weeks, the children began complaining of headaches and nausea. Their schools reported that they had begun to suffer hallucinations, and 2 of them started complaining that they didn't like the place that Mr. Smile was showing them anymore. One began screaming for half an hour, acting as if they were having a fit and screaming for the colors to stop, that the colors were horrible and that they needed them to go away. One of the children claimed that Mr. Smile was talking to them in their head all the time now and was telling them things, terrible things, but that they couldn't talk about it, that they mustn't, because then their parents would know about the terrible things too. The psychiatrist asked them to write down what Mr. Smile was saying, promising that he would show it to no one, managing to gain the trust of one of the boys enough that he agreed. The contents of the book are known only to him and the authorities, but whenever anyone involved has been asked about it, they just get real quiet, and quickly find an excuse to change the subject. The children stopped sleeping. Footage from the security cameras showed them sitting bolt upright, their eyes unblinking, just staring at the wall without moving or making a sound. Sedatives did nothing. One of the girls began cutting strange circular marks into her skin, while 2 of the boys ceased communicating in English altogether. The language they spoke was never identified, and despite numerous people being asked to listen to them, they could not translate what they were saying. By the start of 1999, all 4 of the children had vanished into thin air. There was no trace of who took them. Searches have turned up nothing to this day, with no indication of where they are or if they're even dead or alive. No suspects have ever been found either. All 4 of them appeared to simply vanish into thin air, much like the others, all of whom also remain missing, their disappearances unexplained. I lived next to this one kid who always had bandages wrapped around their whole head, even covering their face. I remembered his name was Wilbur, a 12-year-old boy who never left his house. He sometimes looked out of his bedroom window on the top floor, at all of the kids who would play outside, while Wilbur sat and watched. I remembered his windows had metal bars on them, so there was no way he could climb out of his bedroom windows. We sometimes communicated to each other by writing to each other on pieces of paper, since Wilbur can't hear me because the window was locked. Wilbur only does it when his parents aren't around since they're weird. His mother and father were one of those parents that were insanely crazy about science and chemistry, according to Wilbur. They would stay in their basement and work all day and night, except at the times where they have to give Wilbur some food daily. Now, they're not treating him like an animal. His parents were just very busy. They told Wilbur that he shouldn't go outside to make contact with anyone until his face got better. He told me that he accidentally slipped on one of his parents' chemicals and fell face first, ruining his appearance. And his parents feared that he would be made fun of by the other kids in the neighborhood. I remember one time a couple of older kids were throwing rocks and pebbles at his windows, laughing and pointing at Wilbur as he looked down at them. He told me that they do it a few times, but he's used to it. But to me, he's a great guy and still is today. I've never been inside his house, but he showed me some cool stuff he collected, like comic books. He had loads of them, from Marvel to DC to other non-superhero comics. He was a huge superhero fan. He even said that he felt like a superhero, a normal human being who became affected by dangerous chemicals and then became a powerful superhero. He once wrote on a piece of paper and had it put up to his window as he pretended to be a superhero. I had a collection of action figures and video games that amazed Wilbur. He told me that he never played a single video game in his life, which was quite sad. He also told me that his babysitter took them away from him before he could play them, and burnt them in front of him. Wilbur had a mean babysitter named Miss Fitzgerald, a tall, mean lady who never liked kids at all. This started before his face became messed up, he told me. She was basically every kid's nightmare of all the things I heard she has done. Miss Fitzgerald had babysat many kids before, and trust me, it was not pretty. Wilbur told me that the last kid she babysat, a 4-year-old girl, she made her live through 7 hours of hell. Wilbur said that Miss Fitzgerald starved her and surrounded her bed with a few bear traps, and the worst thing that happened, the parents didn't know about her deed. She would lie to them just to get paid. All those things I've heard, she is a foul, cruel woman with no soul. At all. And now she had to babysit this poor guy. Wilbur was old enough to make his own decisions, except for some. But his parents apparently hired an evil witch. The parents had to go to Texas to a scientist convention, so Wilbur was left alone with her. One time I was writing about her to show to him, but then I saw Miss Fitzgerald forcefully pulling him away from the window, and that was the rest of my day without talking to him. The next day, when I looked through my window to see Wilbur, I saw someone lying down on his bed. Looking at the person's wrapped head, I banged my fist on the window, trying to get Wilbur's attention. He slowly sat up on his bed, wiping away tears from his eyes. He seemed to be crying, which gave me a thought. I had a worried look on my face as I saw bruises all over his arms and legs, a faded dark tone of purple. He went to write something down on a piece of paper. Then, as Wilbur finished writing, he went up to the window and pressed the note on the glass. What he wrote had terrified me. The whole situation still burnt in the back of my mind. Something I knew I would never forget. He wrote, "Help me." What made it worse was that his handwriting was scribbled onto the paper and was almost illegible. Wilbur kept banging on the window with his other hand. Then suddenly I saw someone else run into his bedroom next to him. It was her. You know who. She had something in both of her big, chubby hands. In one hand was a lemon, and in the other was a pair of scissors. What Miss Fitzgerald did terrified me even more. Miss Fitzgerald ran up to Wilbur, grabbing his head, holding it still. I saw him screaming in pain and fear, so I knew I had to do something. At the same time, I couldn't stop watching. She used her scissors to cut open the bandages and unwrap them off his head and threw them to the side. What I saw almost made me vomit, something that sickened me. I was utterly shocked at looking at Wilbur's real, deformed face. His whole head was completely covered by bandages, and what was underneath I knew the purpose to. I saw his face almost melted off, showing a dark red layer underneath. I could only imagine his face looking like melted cheese on a cheeseburger. Wilbur's whole face, even one of his eyeballs, were burned a bit. The chemicals had messed him up badly. Miss Fitzgerald sliced the lemon in half with the scissors, pinning Wilbur down on his bed. Then she threw the scissors to the side next to the bandages and held his head still with one hand. With the other hand, she squeezed a lemon slice onto Wilbur's head, into his eyes, into the red layer of his face. The painful expression on his face, his loud, muffled screams, his face stinging from the acid of the lemon juice. She used the other lemon to squeeze onto his face again, torturing Wilbur with extreme pain. I decided to bang my fist on my window, which was a bad idea. Miss Fitzgerald looked over to the bedroom window right at me. I jumped back. She noticed me. She ran back out of the bedroom, shoving Wilbur down as he screamed in pain and agony. I knew what she was going to do, so I ran out of my bedroom and ran downstairs. The good thing about this situation was that my parents don't know about Wilbur, and the fact that they were at work for a little while. I locked the front door, hoping that Miss Fitzgerald wouldn't burst into my house. I looked around for the house phone, but as I was, a loud bang rang my ears. I looked behind myself at the door, noticing her red, sweaty face and her curly blonde hair. By the looks in her eyes, I knew there was going to be some trouble. She kept banging at the door, nearly screaming her head off. As I looked around for the phone, I finally spotted it, next to the couch on the coffee table. I ran towards it, dialing 911 as the sounds of Miss Fitzgerald's threatening screams were heard from outside. Waiting for a few rings, I finally hear the operator's voice, the usual greeting from a 911 operator. I started explaining the whole situation from beginning to end, as quickly and clear as possible. They told me to wait patiently as the police will arrive at my house soon. It took a few minutes for the police to arrive at my house. Not only did they arrive, but my parents arrived early from work as well. Apparently, they got a call from the police explaining my situation and decided to come home. My parents were extremely worried and frightened. They asked me more questions about it than the police did. I had to explain everything, from being friends with Wilbur to how his parents left him with an abusive babysitter to what she tried to do. About an hour later, a police officer came to me. He had something he wanted to tell me about the horrible atrocities that took place next door. The truth about the babysitter, the parents, and Wilbur was truly shocking. Based on the evidence they found, Wilbur's parents weren't his actual parents at all. They adopted Wilbur from an orphanage that's out of town, only to perform an experiment on him. It was the reason why they moved to Texas, to hide. The babysitter, Miss Fitzgerald, was part of the experiment too. In fact, Wilbur wasn't the first kid to get adopted by the scientists. They had done illegal experiments on those orphans, and it was to find out how much pain a child can take before death, based on the cause of death and the age of the child. 38 children between the ages of 2 and 13 were reported missing, and Wilbur was one of them. There were security cameras on the outside and the inside of the house. Right now, they arrested Miss Fitzgerald for child cruelty and the deaths of many children, and are on the case to find the 2 scientists. All of that, and I was friends with someone who would have been killed if I didn't call the police. Apparently, Wilbur also tried to lie about almost everything he told me. He was trying to protect himself. He was sent to a new trusted family, a married couple who lived out of town. Since then, I never saw him again until now. 20 years later, I went to a bar to get myself a few drinks by myself when a man approached me. "Remember me?" he said, that familiar man smiling at me. I smiled back, realizing how long it has been since I had last seen Wilbur. In fact, he looks like a nice, healthy man now without his bandages. He was a brown-haired man with sky-blue eyes. He almost looked like a complete stranger. And after that, we talked and drank a few glasses, finally speaking to each other in person. Wilbur and I knew that nobody would try to keep us apart. The scientists and the babysitter are probably locked away right now. After all, I still couldn't stop thinking of the fact that this man would have been killed if I didn't help save his life.